everybody. Welcome to the Banyan Books podcast. My name is Ross McKeechee, and today we are in conversation with Suzanne Simard. So delighted to have her here. Before I get into her formal introduction, I'll just make our usual Banyan announcements. First of all, although we have people joining us from around the world in the Banyan Books community, uh, the the physical location of Banyan Books and Sound in Kitsilano and Vancouver is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Banyan Books is in its 50th year as an independent local bookstore, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. So please support Banyan Books. Every purchase that you make through Banyan helps to support these kinds of wonderful free programs like the one today. So you can visit our website, banyan.com, banyen.com. You can make orders over the phone, or you can come in person if you're in Vancouver. The store is open every day of the week, 7 days a week. Now, our amazing guest today, Suzanne Simard, a BC native. Suzanne is a professor of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia. A pioneer on the frontier of plant communication and intelligence, she has been hailed as a scientist who conveys complex technical ideas in a way that is dazzling and profound. Suzanne's discoveries have influenced filmmakers such as James Cameron, who drew from her work to create the Tree of Souls in his film Avatar. Born in the Monashee Mountains of British Columbia to a family lineage of rugged loggers, Suzanne grew up as a child of the forest with a deep connection to nature. She went on to attend UBC and then to complete her PhD in forest sciences at Oregon State University. Before beginning to teach at UBC, she worked as a research scientist at the British Columbia Ministry of Forests. Suzanne is known for her work on how trees interact and communicate using below-ground fungal networks, which has led to the recognition that forests have hub trees or mother trees, which are large, highly connected trees that play an important role in the flow of information and resources in a forest. Her current research investigates how these complex relationships contribute to forest resiliency, adaptability, and recovery, and it has far-reaching implications for how to manage and heal forests from human impacts, including climate change. Suzanne has over 200 peer-reviewed articles. She's presented at conferences around the world and communicated her work through interviews, documentary films, and TED Talks. Her TED Talks have over 10 million views worldwide. Today, she is here in conversation about her instant New York Times bestseller titled Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest. It's a fantastic book. And the book was released in May 2021, and it's currently being adapted into a feature film produced by Amy Adams and Jake Gyllenhaal. Finding the Mother Tree is a moving story of discovery and struggle, which beautifully weaves together Simard's personal life journey with her scientific discoveries and love for the forest. During her rebirth after cancer, Suzanne founded the Mother Tree Project. The guiding principle of this project is retaining mother trees and maintaining connections within forests to keep them regenerative, especially as the climate changes. To learn more about this work, you can visit mothertreeproject.org. Banyan Books community, please join me in warmly welcoming Suzanne Simard.
Suzanne. Thank you, Ross. It's such a great honor to be here.
We're really delighted to have you here. Really, we are.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure. I've always wanted to have a book in Banyan Books because it's such a wonderful bookstore, and I've gone, visited it since I was first went to Vancouver when I was 17. So yeah, it's a jewel.
Really is, yeah. Okay. Now, this book, it's a beautiful book. And I was saying to you before we started, I was really surprised. I mean, you come from a science background, but this book, it's like it's like it's not your first book. It's so beautifully written, and you so beautifully weave in the science, the hard science with your life story, and you really bring alive the BC's beautiful nature. Um, the first thing when I opened the book, you have this quote from Rachel Carlson. And the quote is, "But man is a part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself." Can you tell
Mhm.
us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, Rachel Carson was, you know, she was a paradigm shifter of her time. And I admired her. She brought to the public eye what was going on with pesticides in the, evolving industrial agricultural revolution in the 1960s. And she wrote about it eloquently and heartfully. And ironically, she passed away from breast cancer, which, you know, could have been from the very thing she was fighting, but she fought to the very end. And but the irony is that, yes, this thing, some of these things that we do in our environment, like harvesting too many forests, you know pumping fossil fuels into the environment through the combustion engine, um, it's catching up to us in a lot of ways, and we're experiencing this right now in real time, with the heat dome that we're living through, the fires that we're living through, in Western North America, the changes in weather patterns that we're witnessing. So yeah, I mean, we've brought it on ourselves. These are human caused, but that also means that they're human solvable. And I think that is one of the messages that I wanted to bring in the book, is that there are solutions to these problems. We need to get together our collective genius, our political will, our public will, our science and art, and our great thinkers, and everybody being involved in part of the solution. And I believe that we can overcome this. But we're in a wake-up call right now, and Rachel Carson was, she was a clarion call for what came down the road for us, and I hope that I hope that we can find the wisdom in us to and look at the science, and look at the passion around people are passionate about this. They want a better future for themselves and for their children and coming generations, and so there's definitely, the will is there, and I believe that we have the intellect and the science to carry for us forward as well.
Thank you. Now, this book, it's your life story, and it's a beautiful story. It starts with you as a young woman, and you keep bringing back the memories of your upbringing. Can you tell us a little bit about you have a storied family history that has a relationship to the forest with logging and everything. Can you tell us a bit about your family history?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is just really what I wanted to, when I wrote the book. I wanted to embed the very questions that I asked, about forests, about improving how we interact with forests, embedding it in my family history, into my ancestry, because I came from a place in the forest. I came from this logging family, and so my family, on my father's side, emigrated from France to Quebec, and logged in the in the Canadian Shield for a while, and then decided to move west, in the late 1800s. They settled in Saskatchewan for a while, and then it was too cold, so they headed west. And it was ironic because they thought they were going to go to California, and they took a train, all the kids and my great grandfather and his brothers, west, thinking they were going to land in California. And they opened up the boxcar doors, and the sun came shining in, and they thought, we're here. And they jumped out of the boxcar into snow up to their up to their eyebrows, and they were in Enderby, BC. And they loved it so much that they stayed. They abandoned the idea of California. I think they were also interested in the gold rush at the time, but they, and certainly my great grandfather did end up going to the Yukon and being partly a miner as well. But for the most part, they were horse loggers. And so they settled in the Shuswap River area near Maple Lake. And all of my great grandfather and all of his brothers, and my grandfather and all of his brothers, and my dad and all of his brothers were horse loggers. And so they would go into these interior rainforests, and they did selective logging. And everything was done by hand, starting with the crosscut saw and then moving on to the crosscut chainsaw to then, eventually the chainsaw. But it was always very carefully done. My grandfather was very much understood the forest, and he talked about he knew the species, and they were selecting white pines at first, and then later cedar poles, and he would. My dad would talk about how Grandpa would go up into the forest and make a map for the day, and he'd say, "Okay, we're going to cut this tree down." Like the whole, it took a day to cut down a tree, and it was all very carefully done. When I went up there as a little kid to participate, be part of this logging show, it was the forest was a regenerative place, right? These little gaps that they created in this rainforest were full of hemlocks and Douglas firs and cedars. They were just like booming back to life. And that's when I understood the forest as this incredibly resilient place. And that is what was in my blood and bones. That's how I saw the forest, as this connected, regenerative, pulsing place. And of course that, shaped my career as I became a forester myself. As you mentioned, I went to UBC Forestry, and I entered into the profession of forestry, but that was at the time when clear-cut logging was really taking off. And so that's, from there, developed my career.
Right.
But that's the background.
Right. Yeah. And in the book you talk about, and everybody please read this book. It's not only a beautiful story, it's very informative, and it really inspires you to connect with the forest. Like last night after I finished, I went out and I just lay down in the forest. I was just so inspired by it. You made a promise. You ran into an issue with these young seedlings that weren't taking, and you knew there was you had this intuitive understanding based on your upbringing and your connection to the forest. Can you tell us a bit about that? And then about, you made a promise to the trees.
Yeah. So I came from this incredibly rich, selective horse logging background into industrial logging. And that was at the time when Meares Island was being, protests at Meares Island were occurring over clear-cut logging. Clear-cut logging at that point on the coast had really taken off. It was getting started in the interior forests. I worked in the Lillooet forest area in the Lillooet Mountains. And so these are, just outside of Pemberton, outside of Vancouver. It's a very steep mountainous country. The Lillooet Nation lives there. It's their territory. And we were, the company I worked for, what they did is they clear cut. They took the whole forest down. And then my job was, as a silviculturalist, was to go back and try to reforest these places that there were, basically no trees left. They took everything. It wasn't selective at all. It was just select everything, take it all. And that was, all about making money, right? It was making money for the companies and meeting the allowable annual cut that the province set forward, that, that was basically, trying to, convert our old growth forest to a working forest, to basically a province of plantations. And so I was, looking at these old forests and looking at these plantations and going, these things do not match up, right? That we're growing back, single species plantations out of these, places that have so much diversity, so much species diversity. And the seedlings weren't doing well. They were yellow, they were not connecting to the soil. And that got me started, right? And I always was a lover of soil from as a kid. I used to eat dirt all the time. I loved soils when I went to university. That is one of the focuses of my work. But so it was a natural thing for me to start thinking about the soil and why were these trees not getting what they needed? They were yellow, which meant they weren't getting the nitrogen that they needed. And so I started on that, right? I started slowly through my career piecing this thing together with things that people weren't really thinking about at the time. Why would a tree not be connected to the soil? And that led me to understand about these fungi that actually all of our trees associate with, these mycorrhizas that they depend on, that actually are the great connectors between the photosynthetic leaf area of the trees and the whole cycles in the soil, the nitrogen, phosphorus, water, carbon cycle that are driven in the soil by this photosynthate, and the mycorrhizal fungi are what connect those two amazing processes together. And so I was able to figure out that was part of the problem.
Right. And you made this promise.
Yes, and I made a promise. Yeah. I made a promise to figure it out. And I devoted my whole career to that. And I continued to make promises as I learned more and more. I promised those seedlings I would learn how to do a better job. Eventually, I promised when I got breast cancer and I was treated with Taxol from the yew tree, I promised the yew tree that I would figure out how does it produce that Taxol, and what does an intact forest do for that production of Taxol? How can we, protect those medicines that the forest naturally produces for us, for itself? It turns out that Taxol is a defense enzyme that yew trees use for themselves, but it also works with us to help defend against illnesses. And so I made promises to the yew tree, and I continue to make promises every day that I go to the forest to try to help. And it brings me incredible joy and enrichment in my life. So yes.
And you talk about also this instinct you had to listen. This is a short quote from the book. You said, "My instinct has always been to listen to what living things are saying. We think that most important clues are large, but the world loves to remind us that they can be beautifully small." Mm-hmm. So how has that instinct served you in your whole life's work?
Yeah, I mean, extremely well. We tend to look at things that are like the scale of us, right? Like we're able to, observe the above ground part of the forest and the leaves and the trunks of the trees, and I love it. I'm sure everybody who lives in around forest loves that. We get great enjoyment, we get great spirituality, we get our health is improved being in these forests. But what's really underlying that, I mean, it's definitely photosynthesis in the trees, but trees are microbiomes, just like we are, right? They're full of organisms, little tiny things that you can't see. So these mycorrhizal fungi, for example, if you pull up a little seedling root, like if you see a seedling growing in the forest floor and you pull it up and look at its roots, you can barely see these little fungi that have little threads going off through the soil. And yet this is where this is absolutely crucial to our own lives, that this ancient symbiosis works. It actually was responsible for plants moving from the ocean onto the land. Is those earliest fossil fuel or fossil records showed mycorrhizas had already evolved in those plants at that point, so that the plants could get the nutrients they needed from this barren rock that was the earth at that time. And so, yeah, this is where the really important stuff is. And not just the mycorrhizal fungi, but like in the soil, there's a whole soil food web of billions of organisms that of which we know so very little about. But these are the organisms that take that energy from photosynthesis and they cycle the carbon, they cycle nitrogen, they're important in the hydrology. Like they're absolutely essential. Without them, we would not be here. So yes, I mean, those wonderfully tiny itsy bitsy things that now we can look at using molecular techniques and microscopes and so on is really, it's just absolutely fascinating. We know so little about it, but it is the new frontier. And this is where, this is where these are where a lot of the solutions lie in looking after that incredible food web.
uh, I believe it was Nature magazine with your front page article in '97 when you first published your findings. They called it the Wood Wide Web. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in the Wood Wide Web with mother trees and these nodes and the mycorrhiza underneath?
Yes, yes. So, my first PhD work was inspired by these little yellow seedlings I was seeing in the forest that I'd made a promise to figure out what was going on. And I had been noticing as well as a silviculturalist working for government that, and my job was to try to figure out how to grow these plantations, that not only were they not connecting to the soil, they were getting diseased and infested with insects when we took out the native plants, especially the broadleaf trees, the birches and aspens and cottonwoods. And at the time, foresters were really focused on getting rid of these native plants because they viewed them as competitors for light and water and nutrients. For example, birch grows tall and faster than Douglas fir, and it shades Douglas fir. And so the thinking was, well, birch is robbing Douglas fir of its light and therefore reducing its photosynthetic rate and its growth rate. And so therefore we need to get rid of it. And so there was this all-out war going on in BC of, herbicides and getting rid of these native plants. And I thought, this is what's causing the disease, right? It's actually making things worse. And so I started looking at the connections in the soil. How, I felt we were disconnecting the ecosystem, disconnecting its natural connections. And I'd heard about this work done by David Reed in the UK, who had looked at pine seedlings in the lab that grew together and were affected by a single mycorrhizal fungus. And he saw carbon moving back and forth between them when he labeled one with carbon-14. And I took that idea to the real forest, which was until then had been just done in the lab. And I said, is this what's happening? Is this what we're disrupting, this incredible linkage? And that is what I found. I found that the more paper birch shaded Douglas fir, the more carbon it actually sent straight to Douglas fir to subsidize its losses. And in the spring and the fall, when fir was overtopping birch, when it was leafed out and growing and birch was not leafed out yet, the opposite was happening. Fir was sending stuff back to birch, carbon. And so I started to see the forest as, well, it confirmed my already understanding that the forest was a connected place, but now I could see it using my isotopes and my experiments and demonstrating that this is a complex place where both competition and collaboration are going on. So eventually there was a lot of backlash against this work. There was a lot of disbelief and that these networks existed, that they were important in forests. And so then I later embarked on mapping what that network looked like. And so that's where we went into Douglas fir forest and we just mapped one fungal species out of about 100 that exist in each forest. And we discovered that everything was connected together in this incredible network, and that the most connected trees were these big old trees, the old trees, the ancient trees, the biggest trees in the forest. And it turns out that those trees were sending carbon and nitrogen and water to their neighboring seedlings, helping them regenerate. They were also providing this great network that they were feeding with their own photosynthesis that these seedlings could tap into. And so that's what led us to calling these old trees mother trees. Yeah. So that's a long story to answer that question.
Well, it's a beautiful story and it's fascinating. Now, one thing that's really interesting to me, you mentioned in the book, you're going on a hike as a young woman with your new friend at that time, Jean.
Yes.
And she mentions the Coast Salish people's understanding of the interconnectedness of the trees. How much influence has indigenous wisdom from the BC indigenous people or from other parts of the world influenced your work?
Right now, I'm working a lot with Indigenous people. I would say up until a decade ago, I didn't have a strong connection. I mean, I understood and knew Indigenous people. I worked with them. I went to school with Indigenous people, friends, but I didn't understand the depth and the um, I don't know, the incredible wisdom of their knowledge until I started working with one particular postdoc, Dr. Teresa Ryan, who is a salmon fisheries scientist. And she just started talking to me and saying, you know, our worldview is that we're all connected, we're all one with nature, that we're interdependent, and that we have these principles of things like respect, having respect for plants and trees and water and salmon, that the whole relationship is built on respect and reciprocity, which means that, you know, that we don't take more than we need, or that what is nature is able to give us, that we only, you know, we do what's called an honorable harvest. We harvest only what we need. We don't push these ecosystems to the point of collapse, which is what, you know, our modern, you know, economic driver is driving us to do. And that is why we're seeing, you know, this, you know, major problems in our forests, one of the reasons. So now I'm working a lot with Indigenous people. I actually just went on a 10-day trip with the Kwakwaka'wakw people up to their territory, the Monteguela tribe, to talk about reclaiming their old growth forests. That they really want to get their people back on the land because they've been so disenfranchised through colonialism and the residential school system. And they want to have their presence. They want to be able to carry out their obligations to the forest, because they, you know, they have lived on this land for thousands of years, observed, had their own deep science about looking after the resources. And then that got taken away from them with colonization. And so now I'm working with them to try to find ways that we can reconnect, you know, the Indigenous people and the settler people, to move forward, all of us together, in a more regenerative, more holistic, more sensitive and reciprocal relationship with nature, so that we're all, you know, helping nature to recover from this past century of exploitation, to find a better way. So yeah, I am working with them. I'm working with them through the Mother Tree Project, through the Tree of Life Project, through the Salmon Forests, and the connections I'm have with them are deepening and richer and more exciting all the time.
Fantastic. I'm really curious about the relationship between sort of what we might call the Western modern kind of scientific method versus these ancient forms of knowledge and understanding. Did you ever feel like you had these intuitions and innate understandings about the forest and that interrelatedness? But did you ever feel handcuffed by being tied to the scientific method, and that industry and government were so dependent on the scientific method?
Yeah, I mean, I eventually was able to articulate that, but it took me a long time because, you know, I could see, you know, I had this intuition, this deep knowledge that was grounded in how I grew up in the forest, through, you know, just being a child of the forest and observing things. And then when I started to become a scientist, I had to, in order to survive and make my way, I had to learn the Western ways, of course. That's the only thing that was available to me. And I didn't really know that there were other ways of doing things. It wasn't part of the curriculum in elementary school, in high school, in university. You know, that knowledge has been ignored almost very effectively over the last 100 years, or more, and more. And so, you know, I worked with that Western scientific approach because it has good things about it, right? There are, you know, we've made amazing discoveries with reductionist science, but I was soon hitting the wall, you know, in that forests are not, you can't reduce them to the parts and then reconstruct how it works. You can't take a tree and a plant and some soil and put them together and expect the ecosystem to function. It's like you can't take two eyeballs and a brain and a skull and say, work like a human being, right? There's more to it than that. These are systems that have evolved, and all the organisms in them have evolved to be highly complex. But they work, they're efficient, they're resilient, and they have these incredible, what we call emergent properties, like the ability to cycle carbon, for example. You can't, there are things about that that we'll never completely understand, but it doesn't mean that we ignore them, because that is actually where the, the incredible vitality and resilience comes from, is those things that are of all these parts working together. And so in trying to publish my work about whole forests, I had a hard time doing that in these reductionist science journals, because they really want to look at the little parts, the little tiny studies, ripping things apart. And we've made progress, but we've missed a lot of the big picture with that. And so now, with Indigenous science, it really is not that different than Western science, in that it's grounded in observation, it's grounded in experimentation, it's grounded in adaptability. And it's been carried out over thousands of years of getting to know the land, every intricate detail. When does the salmonberry bloom? How does that coincide with the hatch of the salmon fry in the spring? How does that coincide with the hatch of the insects that the salmon fry, eat? How does that coincide with the production of berries by the salmonberry that we can eat? And so they were able to connect all these dots together. Even this below ground network that I so-called discovered, they knew about it already. They knew that it underlay the forest and it was essential to the growth of trees through thousands of years of observation. And so when colonization happened and we came in with our Western science and said, okay, move aside, we've got this now, we're going to figure this out. Well, we didn't, right? We didn't understand the full picture. And that is where this whole systems level, holistic level of understanding needs to come in. And that is where we have a lot to learn. The Western science is really, as one Aboriginal woman once said, Western science is the little sister of Indigenous science. It's not nearly as well developed, and we have so much to learn to make our ecosystems, sustainable.
Sorry.
Go ahead. No.
Your family is so important to you. In your life, your family has been huge. Your relationship with your parents, with your brother Kelly, your late brother Kelly, and your sister Robin. And in the book, you liken the interrelatedness of the forest to be like a family. Mm-hmm. Can you expand on that idea a little bit for us?
Yeah, we all know what family is, right? We all know what community is. We all come from that. We rely on those connections. And we really, as human beings, I always view myself as just a product of my relationships, of all my family and friends. And, I'm shaped by all the people around, the love that I have for them, the conflicts I have with them, like, the whole thing, right? The whole living experience. And as I came through forestry, realizing that foresters were about disconnecting them, not seeing forests as social places. They were seeing forests as these inanimate trees, objects that they would plant in rows and then weed out and treat like they were just individuals trying to compete with each other. And I saw the forest as a community, as interdependent, and really ecology is based on it. Really is about understanding those relationships. But we didn't live it. We didn't manage it. Forestry is not about that. It's very utilitarian and commodified and about making money. And that that process, we've ignored this familial part of the forest. And there are deep science basis of this as well. I'm not just spouting off. I've investigated this in using all kinds of tools, and I've discovered that, for example, that trees and plants of all different species in the forest, they're interconnected in all kinds of networks. and I could go into great detail about the scientific underpinnings of that, but they are all connected together. They share resources even among different species. Within a species, we also know that trees can recognize their own kin and that they favor their own kin. And even an old tree, you know, most of its seed is shed in its immediate neighborhood, and it can recognize which of those seeds are from its own, like of its own genetic stock, and it can recognize which ones are of different species or of a different, you know, have different parents. And resources are moved around according to maintaining that whole community, to uplifting the community, the like vitality of it, the diversity of it. You know, these connections and these complex interactions really are about building community, about building resilient communities. And, you know, I've made lots of analogies to our own human communities, and I think that's an easy way to understand it, right? We look after each other, we have each other's back, and, you know, yeah, we have conflict as well, and trees do compete with each other as well, but that's all part of the picture. And but the important point here is that forests are social places. Trees need their neighbors. They live beside each other for hundreds of years. They have evolved ways to communicate and interact and look after each other.
I just want to let our live community here know, I see that the questions are already starting to roll in. For those of you who aren't aware, you can submit your questions for Suzanne Simard in the Q&A tab down at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to send in your questions, and we'll be getting to those in a few minutes. I want to touch on nature's capacity to heal. You went through cancer treatments, and you discovered your own body's capacity to heal. And you also speak a lot in the book about nature's capacity to heal, but also that there might be limitations to how far we can take that. Where are we at with that right now? And what are the big red flags, and how do we begin to heal Mother Nature?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, thinking of forests, I'll just give a little demonstration of how, you know, regenerative these networks of forests really are. So here you have a community of forests, of old trees, young trees, teenagers, you know, adults, so on, and they're connected together. Seeds fall to the forest floor. These little seedlings connect into the networks of the old trees. They get resources, they get a boost in life, and then they you know, they take off. Some of them might not make it, you know, if they're in a particularly shady spot, or but you know, a lot of them make it, and they, you know, find their way through the crowns of the forest. And even if they get attacked or infected by some pathogen or insect, that there are all these warning systems and aid systems in the forest where trees can communicate with each other about this, and they're able to upregulate their defenses in response to these communications. As I said, they have all these recognition signals. There's all kinds of signaling going on below ground. It's like a big internet. You could think of it that way. And that's what brings resilience to the forest, right? That's how the forest regenerates, is through all these incredible interactions and ways of communicating between all the creatures. And so the forest has evolved to do that. It's evolved to heal itself, to recover from disturbances. But like I said, and like you said in the just now, there is a limit, right? Like the earth has a capacity. Forests have a capacity to absorb damage or change or trauma. And, you know, there is a tipping point where when you inflict too much damage, that the systems can't recover. You know, if you take away all the forest floor, for example, where all of the insects and worms and nematodes and amoebas are, the cycles stop, or they're extremely retarded, you know, extremely slowed down. And so, yeah, there's a limit. You can't take off the forest floor and expect the forest to actually recover. You can't mine down, you know, over extensive areas, removing soil, and expect the forest to bounce back. You know, it takes what we call pedogenic time to recover, thousands of years to build soil and forest floor again. And, you know, and this isn't esoteric. We do this we actually do this, right? We do it in mining, we do it in agriculture, we do it in bad forestry practices. If we're too extensive in our disturbance, like building too many roads, for example, and landings, or scarifying, or with our machines moving too much forest floor around, we've measured the effects of this, that even in normal logging practices where you have machines on the ground, we're losing about 60% of the carbon in the forest floor just by the act of logging. So that is not irrecoverable damage, but it slows things down a lot. And that also, those stocks, those carbon stocks, they're the buffer against the stocks in forests and oceans are the buffer against climate change. And if we continue to deplete it by logging our old growth forests, our big old growth forests, by damaging the forest floor, it's really hard to recover. You can't get back those old growth forests again. You can't grow back that forest floor without thousands of years of recovery. So yeah, there are limits, for sure there are. And climate change, here we're in a very, scary time right now with the fires and the heat dome, and that this is a warning to us. I think we're going to survive this, but it's a warning to change course, that we need to be more conservative in our practices, be more cautious, not push our systems to the point of collapse, but actually look after them, like be good stewards of the environment. So yes, so in sum, the forest ecosystems, the world has incredible capacity to heal. It's built that way, but we have to be good stewards. We have to be responsible, and we have to, be reciprocal, meaning don't take more than we need, live within our means.
Wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit about the Mother Tree Project?
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to. After I recovered from cancer, I started this project called the Mother Tree Project. And this is the biggest experiment I've ever done. It's growing. I encourage anybody who's interested, if you want to get involved, we've got lots of capacity for people to become involved in many ways, even as citizen scientists. But what we're doing is we're trying to design new forestry practices that will keep our forests resilient as climate changes. So instead of, clear cutting and reducing carbon stocks and planting and hoping that these forests will recover and weeding them out, what I'm suggesting, or what our study is doing, is testing different ways to keep old mother trees, still take out some trees to meet our needs for housing and so on. So it's like selective logging, kind of like what my grandpa did, but leaving old trees, and we're leaving them in different amounts and configurations in different climatic regions. So right now we have 9 forests, each replicated 3 times. So that's 27 forests that are scattered from the US border all the way up to Fort St. James, which is north of Prince George, in all these different climatic regions in Douglas fir forests. And we're trying all these different ways to leave old trees and comparing the effects of that on the carbon cycle, on biodiversity, and on the regenerative capacity of the forest. And I'll just give you a hint of what we're finding. We already know, based on only 5 years of measurements, that it's absolutely essential to keep these old trees around, that they're the legacies that boost the next forest forward, to provide the connections to the past and to the future, literally through their mycorrhizal connections, that leaving old trees in different configurations, it's going to depend on the climatic area you're in, but they help us keep the biodiversity. So for example, when you clear cut log, what we're finding is you lose the lichens in the crowns, obviously, of the trees, and you lose the mosses on the forest floor. A lot of the herbs and shrubs will recover, but there are whole functional groups of plants that we lose. And then from a carbon cycle point of view, we are able to protect a lot of the carbon stocks by leaving a good portion of these old trees. And of course, they provide seed, and they naturally regenerate, and they protect the seedlings coming up. And we've also found that we can even introduce immigrants. So there's a lot of talk about assisted migration right now, and we're practicing that in forestry that as climate changes, trees can't keep up with it, right? They can't move, they can't adapt that quickly, they can't migrate that quickly. And so foresters are doing this thing where they're actually migrating more, genotypes from warmer climates further north. And so we're doing that in our experiment as well to see how well it works. And what we're finding is that when we leave old trees, especially on stressed sites, that we can increase the survival of those trees is increased by 20 or 30%. And so there's a real synergy there. And so I just think that, and I'm not the only one who's looking at partial retention of old trees. Lots of people have looked at this and have, generally find that it's really helpful to do that, to have this more regenerative approach to forestry instead of just taking everything, clear cutting and extensively. So I could go on about that, but that's the core of the Mother Tree Project is to continue doing that research.
What a hopeful and beautiful project. I feel quite moved by what you're doing, and
Thank
I
you.
understand you've got kind of a 100-year timeline. So this is something that's going beyond your lifetime. It's for
Yes.
future generations.
Yes. Yes. And isn't that what we all, as a parent, as a teacher, that is the greatest gift I could ever give to myself or to my children or to my students, to the world, is to leave this legacy project that can be built upon and help find answers. And yes, I mean, every year I have about 20 students that work with me out in the forest, digging up soils, measuring plants, measuring logs and trees, and the students absolutely love it. They immediately connect with the forest, which is an essential part of loving the forest. And and it's their project, right? They're full of ideas. Why don't we look at this? Why don't we look at the birds that are, inhabiting the cavities and the snags that have been created in this forest, for example, right? They take it and they run with it. And I also mentioned that we would like to take this project up the coast. So a number of First Nations have expressed incredible interest in developing the same project in the coastal regions. So we have one site at Malcolm Knapp Research Forest, which is in the Kitsi Nation, near Maple Ridge, but we're also looking to work with the Kwakwaka'wakw, the Hailtsik, the Tsimshian, and the Haida people to expand this project so they can find alternatives to clear cutting, which has been going on extensively in their territories. And so there's a great deal of hope and of their youth also doing the work themselves and finding their own way with this as kind of a framework to help them out.
Beautiful. Now we're going to get to some of our live audience questions. The first one is from Alma. Alma says, "I'm curious about the mycelium network underneath pavement in cities. Do trees in cities have the same network, or is it completely disrupted? I'm thinking between the few old growth trees and new trees from one city to another, i.e., do old trees in Stanley Park link with trees in other city parks?"
Oh, that's a great question. So certainly in Stanley Park, those networks are intact, right? The Stanley Park is rich with different species. Certainly it's been selectively logged, and we've had the windstorm, about over a decade ago, which, a lot of trees blew over. But those networks are regenerative as well. So they recover, as long as there's living trees, photosynthesis going on, they recover. And it takes, when a forest has been disturbed, say it was clear cut, it takes about 100 years for that whole network to recover, all of the species to come back, but it starts right away. So yes, I mean, Stanley Park, all the parks in the city would have these networks. And the more trees and native plants there, the richer that network will be. When you have more exotic trees, or if you just have grass, those networks do simplify down. However, okay, so get to the other part of the question, would the parks be connected together? Well, it depends on how far apart they are. But certainly, for example, if you're in Stanley Park and, there's boulevards of trees that go into the West End, for example. And the cedars form, and the maples and the yews form arbuscular mycorrhizas, and a lot of the maples in those boulevards that are going up those streets, they would also form these arbuscular networks, and they could link together. The challenge that they have, and what trees have when we just introduce them into urban environments, is often in construction, that the soil is removed, that the engineers work with the fill that's remaining, which tends to be like, it's like glacial till. There's not a lot of organic matter in it. And so those trees are at a disadvantage from the start. And a way to enhance those connections between the parks, the natural forests, and the streets is to actually provide real soil for those trees that are planted, especially topsoil or forest floor, that's where the living suite of the soil food web is. And so you can enhance that ability of the networks to form by introducing good soil and species that are good companions, that actually are able to connect with the trees in those parks and forests. And I didn't get into this, but there are different kinds of mycorrhizas that associate with different species and different groups of plants. And so you need to match those things up, but it's not hard to do. That information is out there. So I would encourage people to do that. And yeah, and thinking about underneath a road, for example, this is another common question I get is, can a tree on one side of a road and a tree on the other side of a road connect together? Well, if there is a pathway of good soil underneath, then they will. Yeah, they will connect together. And in time, they're able to do that. But it makes it a lot better if we can provide them with a good foundation to start with.
Thank you. The next question is from Angela, who says, as an educator, I was hoping you can speak to our educational system, to how our educational system needs to change to bring about the understanding needed for land-based healing.
That's an excellent question. And I'm a prof at a university, and I think that these same ideas are translatable across all parts of the education system, from kindergarten up to the university and beyond. And that is to get kids into the forest, into these natural ecosystems. If they're disconnected from them, they're going to remain disconnected and not know how to love them and protect them. And so it's essential. And this is what I do with my students, is I take them to the forest. And I take students that from all over the world. Some of them have never been in a forest before. They've lived in a city their whole life. And when they get there, I get them to just, here's a good exercise that anybody can use with their kids. I take them into the forest in Pacific Spirit Park, where I teach. And we just sit on the forest floor and lay down. And I say, okay, let's just be quiet with these trees for 5 minutes. And at first the kids are kind of fidgety, and they're trying to put their phone somewhere and maybe turn it off. And then another minute goes by and the fidgeting is still there, but it's calmed down a little bit. And then after another minute, it starts to go quiet. And then the kids open up their senses and they hear the birds. They can hear, the squirrel climbing up the tree. They can hear the squirrel chomping away on that cone to get the seeds. They might hear, a rodent nestling in the grass, maybe a vole or something. They'll hear the water trickling by. They'll hear their neighbor breathing in and out. They become one with the forest, and it doesn't take very long. It's like meditation. Once you lock into it, you're there, right? It's the same with these kids. They're naturals at it. They love it. And I know in the 12 or 13 weeks that I teach my course, by the time we get to the end of the 13 weeks, where we spent every week going out into the forest, they just want to get back out there. It's in their blood and bones. And so that's when I know I've done my job as an educator, is I've helped them connect with the forest. And of course, I also wrap around them. I hug them with the information I know, right? I tell them about the networks in the forest. I show them, what they look like. We go on lots of field trips. Um, it, I'm like an ectomycorrhiza where I hug them with this hyphal network and I say, here, here it is, take it, learn from it, and now it's up to you. And they do it. And I've even taught little kids in grade 1, and they actually do just the same thing. I go into these little, and I take them out in the forest. We lay down on the roots and just listen, and they're full of ideas. They're naturals at it. So yeah, I think that's the essential thing. Get them out there, get them in the forest, and then teach them about these principles that we've learned from our Indigenous neighbors, about respect and reciprocity, and about giving and never taking too much, about responsibility as well, that we have a responsibility to our earth and to each other to care for this earth, not to exploit it, but to look after it, to be sensitive to its needs. Because it's sensitive to ours too, right? So that is what reciprocity is all about. So anyway, those are a few ideas. They're very fundamental, but it's a good place to start.
Thank you. There's a question from Jared who asks, can you speak to the best practices for forest fire management in terms of forest thinning projects? What should we be clearing out of the bush, if anything, and what should stay? How can we promote forest thinning for forest wildfire management while also retaining forest floor biodiversity?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is such a complex problem. And so I'll just start off, there's some fundamental things that need to be done. So first of all, when we're under heat waves like this, it's hard to stop a fire from starting, right? I mean, if there's an ignition source, when it's so dry, it doesn't matter how much fuel is in the forest, there's going to be a fire. But we can reduce the fuel load. That is, so we need to deal with climate change. In other words, that's the overarching thing, is that we've got to deal with that at the same time as we're managing the land. We've got to decarbonize. We've got to reduce our fossil fuel reliance and move on to renewable energy. I know it's a mantra, but it's true. Unless we do that, we're nothing that else that we're going to do is going to solve the problem. So then on the ground, then as we're dealing with climate change, we also need to reinstate some of the, and I'll call them Aboriginal ways of managing the land, is reinstate prescribed burning in our forests, because that prescribed burning that was done for thousands of years reduced the understory in a very natural and holistic way. Because fire itself is a regenerative tool, right? It is, when you burn the forest floor, it actually releases a whole bunch of nutrients that thinning doesn't do, right? Thinning doesn't actually burn the needles and the mosses and the grasses and remove them and release nutrients. Thinning, actually, they're still locked in there even when you thin. So I'd say reinstating prescribed burning, it's got to be done extremely carefully, because we've got people on the landscape, we've got property, we want to protect things, but we can very carefully, and that is going to take a lot of people thinking really hard about this, how to do it, but we can do that. And then, in areas around townships where it's hard to do prescribed burning, or we don't have time to, we've got to act now. Then yes, going into areas where there's an understory that has built ladder fuels up to the crowns, that's really dangerous, because if a spark starts in there, the fire does just blow ladders up into the crowns of the intermediates and up into the crowns of the big trees, and then it becomes like this stand destroying fire. And so you can remove those fuels and you can thin them out. And I think that's a good, it's not a bad practice, it's a good practice. And so I would focus on the smaller trees, taking those out and leaving the trees that are old, the old trees, with their thicker bark. They've lived through many disturbances, they've got defense, they've already got some defense in them, they've resined over these old scars, they've got defense enzymes, they can survive these fires, whereas the younger, smaller stems can't, and they're the ladder fuel. So LADDER, by the way. Yeah, so, and communities are doing this, and I know in my community of Nelson, there's been a lot of it done. It looks really good. I think they've done a really good job with it. I noticed in some communities that it could be used as an excuse for logging old growth forests, because money has been invested in fire smarting communities. So we have to be really, really careful not to be tempted by that, not to use an excuse to go and log old forests, because they are actually very protective for the communities. Old trees are resistant to fire. Young trees are more flammable, they burn more easily. The other thing we can do is we can introduce more broadleaf trees around our communities. They have much higher water content. They have less resin in them. They don't burn as readily. They're not as flammable. And so, sort of changing the successional patterns of the forest by introducing more broadleaves can be very helpful.
Thank you. And you mentioned old growth forests, and this is a thank you everybody who's here live for your great questions. Unfortunately, we can't get to all of them. There are many. We have a last one from Paula, who says, "What can we do besides sign petitions to stop BC from destroying old growth forests and start to follow more ecologically sound forestry principles? We've been trying for so long, and they aren't listening."
Yes, thanks, Paula. I agree. It's very frustrating. That and like, just to understand why, there's been the protests at Fairy Creek. There's going to be ongoing protests, is my hunch. There's one starting up in Revelstoke to protest against old growth logging. And those protests arose out of frustration that there's been no action. And the lack of action is because we kind of got, when British Columbia was settled, there were a bunch of commissions that were set forward, and the working land base was identified, and there was an allowable annual cut that was determined, and it's still determined every year. And that allowable annual cut is supposed to be based on the growth rates of the forest, what it can, to be sustainable. But, our forests we miscalculated. We've pushed our forests to the brink of collapse, and we're seeing that in the fires. We're seeing that in climate change. We're seeing it in the contributions of our forests now becoming carbon sources instead of carbon sinks to climate change. So there's all kinds of, we've lost biodiversity. There's all kinds of indicators we've pushed it too far. But the province has become locked into this calculation or this pattern, right? That they said, this is our cut. The cut level has been the same for the last 2 decades, pretty much. I think it's like 70 million cubic meters a year. And it has not varied very much. It's like, okay, we're doing this and we're going to stick on this track. I think that it's hard to, get them off the track. There's a whole infrastructure. There's industries that have developed around that. There's interests in it. There's financial interests in the status, maintaining the status quo. People have also been told that their jobs depend on it. Well, actually, I would really look hard at that. Some jobs are dependent on it, but not as many as in the past. In fact, we've lost about 50% of our forestry jobs over the last decade due to mechanization. So the jobs argument doesn't really hold water. And so really it comes down to, profit and making money and, tax dollars, I guess. But, we can't sustain it. We're seeing, as I said, the indicators are out there, the fires, they're the big indicators are suggesting that, we're on the wrong track. So what do we do? So, we can publish scientific articles. Well, that's easy to ignore. We can have think tanks. Well, we've had lots of those. We can have, reviews. Well, we've had a lot of those as well, and no action. So what are we left with? Well, I feel that myself, I as a studier of the forest, as someone who has knowledge of the forest, I've come to the point where I've written this book, for example, to try to get the public to be more aware of, to reveal, what's going on and what we could do better. And I think everybody can take their own approach to do that. But I think that we need to have various ways of catching the attention of government to make changes. And that attention is going to have to spread, right? It may start at Fairy Creek, but it's going to grow. I think it's going to grow. And then once, once there's a momentum, then there'll be an interest in listening to the public. But so my advice, I guess, to everybody is don't stop, keep the passion up, um, follow your heart, find out everything you can, like get as much information as you can. Like there is really excellent science out there to guide us, and pressure our governments, hold their feet to the fire to do a better job. Um, and it's not just about voting, right? Because voting is important, but even politicians who make promises break those promises all the time, and so we need to hold their feet to the fire in whatever way we can do that. So, and it takes all of us. It's going to take all of us to change this course, in my opinion.
Thank you. Now, you said part of what you're doing is you've written this book, and I mentioned at the start that this book has been taken on to be adapted as a screenplay for a major film produced by Amy Adams and Jake Gyllenhaal. Can you tell us a bit about that just before we finish up, and your hopes for how this might spread more awareness?
Yeah, I have great hopes for this feature film. And yeah, at this point, they're still looking for a director. So they're trying to find a great director. Amy Adams has worked with some of the best directors in the world, and she's going to find the best she can, and Jake Gyllenhaal as well. And then once they have a director, they're going to get a screenplay writer, and they're going to get the best in the world, and that they can get for this to match with this topic. And then I'm an executive producer apparently, and so I have a say in the movie. But what I really want is them to create out of the book their own vision, their own creativity, to see what they, because everybody brings creativity to this crisis, and so, and of course, I'll try to influence them. I'll show them, educate, I guess, show them places in our beautiful province of where things can be improved, where things I think have gone wrong, and I'm hoping that it will bring great awareness to everybody of how we can do a better job with this. And yeah, I think it could be extremely impactful. I think that it can bring a great deal of hope for us to make the changes that we need. But it's like, let's not just wait for the film. Let's keep going, right? We've got to keep going and trying to pressure for a better way for change.
Wonderful. Suzanne Simard, thank you so much for being here. And I'll remind everybody her new book, which is going to be made into a motion picture, Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest. You can learn more about Suzanne's work at mothertreeproject.org. And again, this is the Banyan Books and Sound podcast. We were in conversation today with Suzanne Simard. A big thank you to the Banyan Books community who have been so supportive over the years. A big thank you to Jacob Steele, who produces all of Banyan's events, all of these wonderful free programs that everybody gets to participate in. And a reminder, please support Banyan Books to keep these kinds of programs going. Our website is banyan.com, BANYEN.com. Again, Suzanne, big thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you so much. And thanks, Jacob, too, and Banyan Books. Thank you so much.